Well, it is time for our weekly feature, Going Green. By the year 2020, less than 2 years from now, really, we will have seen a two-thirds decline in global wildlife populations. That is the current rate of biodiversity loss in the world. And in a country like ours, in such urgent need of development, should biodiversity even matter? Is it a case of competing priorities? Is development at loggerheads with the natural world, or are they essentially two sides of the same coin? President Cyril Ramaphosa says biodiversity in the economy can unlock 162,000 jobs and generate around 47 billion rand for the country's gross domestic product. He was speaking at the launch of the Biodiversity Economy Operation Phakisa in Limpopo last weekend. Well, the CEO of the Worldwide Fund for Nature South Africa, Dr. Morne du Plessis, attended the launch and joins us now to have a discussion. And good evening to you, and thank you, of course, for participating tonight in our conversation. The first thing I want to ask you is, when we talk about biodiversity, what does it actually mean? Because we all assume we know.
Yes, of course. And, you know, for some of us, we can imagine that biodiversity is an abbreviated form for biological diversity. And this, of course, includes the count of the number of species that we have. So a sparrow and a dove would be two different species, but biodiversity is actually a concept that includes also the interaction between species. So, for example, if you have a seed that grows into a tree, you have pollinators that move around between trees, bees and so on, to take the pollen around. And you get, for example, a bird that comes to feed on the fruit of the tree. That interaction, the whole range of interactions of pollination, of seed dispersal, and of eating and sustaining oneself on the fruit is part of biodiversity. So it's a complex web of interactions between many different species.
And so when we talk about biodiversity then as an urgent matter, you'd have heard my introduction in terms of just how much we are losing. Why is it so increasingly important for us to tackle? Well, I think human beings have had the luxury of living in a fairly empty world in the past, and therefore been able to get away at times with waste, with excessive consumption, with excessive clearing and transformation of habitats. This is no longer the case, where we as a global population are at levels where we have to tread very, very carefully and not live with a lot of waste. Now, if we talk about biodiversity, South Africa is particularly well blessed with many, many different types of species. In fact, by some accounts, South Africa counts among the top 3 most biodiversity-rich countries in the world. By most counts, we would come at least in the top 5 or top 10. And this essentially means that we are inordinately blessed with the riches, the wealth of biological diversity. And I think the President attended this launch of the Biodiversity Economy Strategy specifically to focus our attention on the fact that we as a country are richly blessed. We have to nurture and look after that, and at the same time make sure that the economic and development opportunities that arise as a result of this. I mean, let's just talk about that. I raised the question in my introduction, this idea of biodiversity being at loggerheads with the natural world. In South Africa, our big focus is around developing this economy, growing this economy. Why does biodiversity matter in that context?
Yes, so I think perhaps the best example of why biodiversity matters, or why the environment or nature for that matter matters. It's not a set aside kind of narrow interest of a few people who are biological nutters.
if we look, for example, at water and the recent water crisis that a place like Cape Town has been through, and that parts of the Eastern Cape, eastern seaboard of our country are currently battling with, water scarcity as a part of the ecological services that are provided to underpin our economy, the provision of water, for example, that is something that really, really focuses the mind. So we think of water and the access to water and the production of water of something that is a free and natural good that we never account for, that we never think about, that we never care about, that we never nurture. But the moment that you start running out of water, as Cape Town was looking into the eyes of an impending disaster, suddenly the mind becomes very, very concentrated. And at a time here a few months ago in Cape Town, people were very, very focused on doing everything possible to spare, to save every last drop of water, to think about the ecological systems, the mountain catchments, and the way in which we nurture and go about treating those catchments. We were in fact looking at the mountain catchments as the cow that gives us the milk. And the moment that you start damaging the cow's ability to produce milk, you no longer have that milk to drink. And I think this reality is taking shape also in the thinking of government. And I was particularly pleased to see the President speak so powerfully, so convinced of the fact that we have to look at the underpinnings of our economy. In other words, we're looking at the same or two sides of the same coin when we're looking at development versus the protection or conservation of biodiversity.
In fact, he was quite specific. He spoke about the purposeful development of our biodiversity economy, did he not?
Yes, he did. And so when I talked about the biological riches that South Africa has, that is not something we have done anything to earn. That is something that we were just blessed with. We've inherited. Every South African is part of this inheritance. We've inherited this magnificent natural heritage. Put on top of that the beautiful traditional knowledge systems that come about. And you then have also the opportunity for us to delve into biological diversity in a way that would lead to new products, cosmetic and pharmaceutical products that form the basis of many of the things that we do, the products we clean ourselves with. If we, for example, just look at the economic opportunities that sit in a natural product such as rooibos, the tea that we know, we're exporting that across the world. That's an example of a natural product, a natural inheritance that we've received that through indigenous knowledge systems have been homed in on and are now being produced for economic benefit, for the employment of people and the economic benefit of South Africans. We look at amarula as a fruit, which is also used in some products that is also selling internationally. These products need to be developed very extensively, and then we have to make sure that the people who grow these products and live in systems where they occur naturally are the primary beneficiaries of the wealth, also the economic wealth that this brings about. And I think the biodiversity economy strategy that's being laid out for us by the President is testimony to the fact that we take this very, very seriously.
I mean, I think it's also, if you want to think of it as low-hanging fruit in a sense, the idea of using indigenous knowledge systems to create economic opportunities for people around the country to make sure that this isn't some idea that comes, with preconceived ideas, from outside, but really is a grassroots opportunity that is used to create jobs for people.
Yes, indeed. And so we, as I said, we're extremely blessed with a rich diversity of biological entities. Now, if we just look at plants, South Africa has around 22,000 different species of plants. Few of us know what that looks like compared to other nations, but this is tremendous. And out of these 22,000 plants, there are already 25 species like the rooibos, like the amarula that I referred to earlier, that have been identified as of possible possibilities for innovation and further development for commercialization. That's just looking at the bio-trade aspects, but then we also have to remember that there's also the so-called wildlife opportunities that exist. This is where breeding of wildlife for trade in animals, for hospitality on private and community land, for hunting, and also for meat and skin products. Leather, for example, for shoes from the skins of some of our wildlife species. These provide phenomenal opportunities, and with increased investment also supported by the private sector with some seed funding from government, means that these industries can then draw in to a significant extent the communities in South Africa and many black South Africans who've been excluded from the so-called biodiversity economy in the past. It's envisaged that by 2030, that 30% of the bioeconomy will be, the benefits from that will be derived by black South Africans who currently are playing very little part in benefiting from that part of our economy.
Because it's going to be important to make sure that whatever discussions are being held around this are not seen as something that is imposed from outside, and not seen as elitist. I'm really curious about how indigenous knowledge systems are going to be harnessed to make sure that that economic inclusion you are talking about becomes a reality and becomes sustainable.
Yes, of course. So when we look at indigenous knowledge and the transfer of that knowledge into all the way through the development, the refinement of these ideas, of course, it involves a lot of science. So there are science laboratories, there are academic institutions who specialize in taking what might be hearsay, beliefs, or very basic products that indigenous communities have been using for many centuries, that these then get converted so that the chemistry, the chemical compounds can be isolated, these can be treated and taken to the point where these products can then be extracted from the natural sources. So, of course, in order to extract these compounds from natural sources, you also need to grow and to cultivate mainly plant species, but not only plant species, but you need to cultivate them. So there is the intention that every year there'll be in the order of 500 hectares of new cultivation of indigenous plant species for the biotrade to be taking place. So there are phenomenal opportunities both in the cultivation, in the laboratory testing, and in the economic development of those, taking it all the way through the pipeline, through incubation, through then full-on production. And of course, what we care a lot about in the biodiversity sector is to ensure that the rural economy, people in rural areas in particular, benefit from this, because one could say that in the past, a lot of this knowledge would have been hijacked, taken abroad, developed, not because people had necessarily ill intent, but because this knowledge was sitting around freely, it was then taken, and the ability to take it through the laboratory system and to commercialization would exist largely overseas. We want to make sure that in future we harness that for the benefits of South Africans and not to just export this or to have it taken and developed elsewhere.
Yes, indeed. I think the two words I'm thinking as you are speaking there are sustainability and inclusion. Those are going to be key to any future biodiversity economy for it to really reach as many South Africans as possible. We'll have to leave our discussion there with CEO of the Worldwide Fund for Nature South Africa, Dr. Morne du Plessis from our Cape Town studios. With this week's conversation, of course, around our weekly feature, we do want you to send us your comments. The hashtag is Full View on Twitter. Feel free to continue sending those voice notes, video calls. The number is 066 479 8056. It is indeed, of course, you can find these interviews, rather, I should say, on sabcnews.com. We're on Facebook and on Twitter.